Storm in the Pacific. The sun was setting low over the Pacific, a fiery red ball sinking slowly beneath the horizon. For a brief moment, the waters were calm, almost serene, their glassy surface stretching far beyond what the eye could see. The sky was a brilliant array of warm colors, golds, oranges, and purples, all blending together into one breathtaking canvas. It was peaceful, but it wouldn't last. Not today, not here in the waters off the coast of Leyte. My name is Samuel Grayson. I served aboard a destroyer during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944, a time that feels both distant and painfully close. I was just a kid, barely 20 years old, when I was thrown into the chaos of war. I didn't know it then, but those moments, those nights, would change me forever. I could never shake the feeling that I was part of something larger than myself, something much more significant, something that would eventually leave scars in places I couldn't see. On that day, we didn't know that we were walking into the eye of the storm. Our ship, the USS O'Bannon, was just one small piece in a much larger puzzle, but for all the world, it felt like we were the last line of defense. It was October, just a few months after the Allies had begun pushing the Japanese back across the Pacific. Leyte Gulf, though, would be the stage for one of the largest naval battles in history. None of us knew how bad it was going to get. I remember the sounds, the creak of the ship's metal hull beneath our boots, the constant hum of the engines, and the faint sound of sailors chatting in the distance. The air smelled of salt and oil. But what stands out the most is the silence that crept in as the days wore on. The kind of silence you only get when you're waiting for something to happen. The kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. When the word came down that the Japanese were approaching, it was as if the world itself had stopped. The men around me weren't talking anymore. There was no bravado, no wisecracks or playful bets. The realization was there, hanging in the air. We were about to face the storm. The morning broke, and with it came the roar of engines overhead. A swarm of Japanese aircraft descended from the clouds, the unmistakable roar of their engines filling the air, louder than the crashing waves beneath us. The first wave came fast and hard, diving straight for our fleet. But it wasn't the planes that got to me at first. It was the realization that we were already outnumbered. That we were the target. That was the true terror of war, the knowledge that you could be gone in an instant. Not just you, but everyone. Your brothers in arms. The ones you had laughed with. The ones you'd shared stories and fears with late at night under the flickering lights in the mess hall. They weren't just your crew anymore. They were your family. We were ready for them, or at least we thought we were. Gunfire erupted from every side. The air was thick with smoke and chaos. Men screamed orders, voices lost in the blur of explosions and gunfire. I manned my station at the guns, feeling the shockwaves of every blast rattle my bones. I kept my eyes focused, waiting for the moment to take the shot. The adrenaline was pumping, the fear was there, but the training kicked in. You don't have time to think when you're in the middle of it. You just react. One plane dived straight at us. I saw it coming, a kamikaze. His eyes, I swear to God, I saw his eyes as he made the final dive. It was like he knew something we didn't. His plane was a missile, a weapon of certain death, and there was no way to stop him. Not in time. The roar of the impact was deafening. It struck the bow of a nearby ship, the USS St. Lo. The explosion was catastrophic. For a moment, I thought we were next. We'd heard stories of kamikazes before, terrifying stories of planes crashing into ships with devastating consequences. But hearing it, feeling it, it was like the world itself had shattered. The seconds after the explosion were pure chaos. Smoke poured into the sky. There was no air, no breath, just the burning smell of oil and metal. It felt like the whole sea was fighting against us, crashing in waves of destruction. I could hear the cries of men over the ship's intercom, orders shouted, confusion reigned. But in that moment, all I could think about was how close the end had come. We had survived the first wave, but how many more were out there? Would we make it through this? I stood frozen, staring out over the water. The sun was hidden behind smoke and debris. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. The ship's bells were ringing, orders shouted, and yet the world outside seemed impossibly still. I was waiting for the next wave, the next attack, the next bomb to fall. We all were. It was just another moment of the storm. The storm we had no choice but to ride out. The smell of burning fuel, of metal twisted into impossible shapes, lingered in the air long after the Kamikaze struck. The ship trembled beneath us, as though we're fighting to stay afloat in a world that seemed to be falling apart around it. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But in those few heartbeats after the first impact, time seemed to stretch. For a brief second, I thought maybe we had won. Maybe the storm had passed. But I was wrong. It wasn't over. And we were far from safe. I watched as men scrambled across the deck, their faces masks of focus and fear. They were carrying fire hoses, dragging bodies from the wreckage. I could see the fire spreading, flames licking the side of the St. Lo, that once proud ship now engulfed in orange hell. It was hard to look away from the fire, like a cruel siren calling us to witness something we didn't want to see but couldn't avoid. The ship was burning. The men aboard it were dying. And there was nothing we could do. In that moment, a thought crossed my mind. How long would it be before we burned too? I was snapped out of my daze when the voice of my commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Thomas, broke through the smoke and noise. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. Get to your post. The words felt like a punch to the gut. I'd heard those orders countless times, but now they carried the weight of something far heavier. The storm wasn't coming for us. It was already here. I ran to my station at the starboard gun turret, my boots pounding against the deck. My hands shook as I gripped the cold steel of the weapon, but I couldn't let it show. Not now. Not in front of my crew. We were all we had out here. Each other. If one of us faltered, the whole ship would go down. I wasn't about to let that happen. The radar operator called out the coordinates. The planes were coming in fast again. Another swarm. This time, they came in low, their engines cutting through the air like a swarm of hornets. The roar was deafening, and I could feel the vibrations in my bones as I aimed the guns. My finger hovered over the trigger, ready to fire at the first enemy I could see. The sky was filled with them, planes diving in from every angle. Kamikazes, all of them, their pilots determined to take us down no matter the cost. My heart pounded in my chest, but my mind was focused. Target locked. I squeezed the trigger. The rapid fire of the guns split the air, the recoil shaking my entire body with each shot. The first plane went down in a fireball, beautiful, horrifying explosion that made the sea below seem like it was boiling. It was a fleeting victory, though, as the second plane came barreling toward us. I barely had time to react before it was upon us. This one was different. The pilot was coming straight at us, no evasive maneuvers, just a direct line to our ship. I could see his face, or at least I thought I did. A blur of determination, a man willing to die for his cause. I couldn't fathom it. I couldn't understand the madness that had led him to this point. But I didn't have time to think about it. He was almost on top of us. The ship rocked violently as we fired once again, but this time the plane wasn't going to be stopped. It struck the starboard side of the O'Bannon, the force of the impact throwing me backward. I hit the deck hard, my head slamming against the steel. My ears rang. The world spun around me. Blood was trickling down my face, but I didn't feel it at first. I was too stunned, too disoriented. I fought to stay conscious, struggling to push myself back up. The screams of my fellow sailors were muffled, distant, as though I were underwater. Smoke and debris filled the air, the heat from the fire on the deck unbearable. The sound of engines, of gunfire, of men shouting, it all blended into one cacophonous nightmare. When I finally managed to rise to my feet, the world around me was burning. The ship was listing to one side, smoke billowing out from the hole where the plane had crashed. I staggered forward, looking for my crew, looking for anyone. My legs were weak, my head still spinning, but there was no time to slow down. I found Lieutenant Commander Thomas in the midst of the chaos, barking orders. His face was grim, covered in soot and ash, but his eyes were hard, focused. He was always the first one to jump into the fire. It wasn't the first time I had seen him like this. He was a leader, and in times like these, we needed him to be. "We're still afloat," he said, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "But not for long if we don't get the fires under control. We can't afford to lose another ship." I nodded, even though I knew the odds weren't in our favor. We'd survived the first wave, but that was no guarantee of anything. The Japanese forces were relentless, and with each passing hour, The battle was becoming more and more desperate. The sound of more planes filled the air, and once again, we braced ourselves. The storm wasn't over. Not by a long shot. We were in the thick of it now, and all we could do was fight back, hold on, and pray for daylight. We had been at sea for what felt like days, though it was only a few hours since the first kamikaze struck. The fire on board the O'Bannon raged on, stubborn and unrelenting, as though it knew the heart of the ship was breaking. The smell of smoke and burning metal clung to everything. My skin, my clothes, my lungs, everything carried it. But we couldn't stop to think about it. We had no choice but to keep moving, to keep fighting, even as the flames danced higher around us, and the sea below grew darker with every passing minute. The battle had escalated. Another wave of kamikazes had come in, and there was no time to breathe, no time to think, just to react. I was back at my station at the starboard turret, the gun's recoil shaking my hands as I fired round after round at the incoming planes. My mind was on autopilot, but even then, I couldn't help but feel the horror of what was happening. We were under attack from every angle, surrounded by the enemy. Their planes were coming in like vultures, like they knew we were already on the edge of collapse. But somehow we hung on. We had to. The first few planes we hit were torn from the sky, exploding into fireballs that lit up the night. But it wasn't enough. More kept coming. The waves were endless. Every time one of our gunners took a shot, another plane appeared to take its place. The sky above was a dark canvas streaked with fire, the sound of gunfire and explosions filling the air. It was all I could hear. The world felt like it was falling apart piece by piece. Every moment we survived felt like a gift. But as the hours dragged on, the weight of it began to settle in. The ship was taking a beating. We were losing men. The hull of the O'Bannon was pockmarked with holes from shrapnel, and the deck was slick with oil, blood, and seawater. Men who had been standing next to me moments before were gone. 1 second, they were there, ready to fight. The next, they were nothing but shadows in the smoke, their bodies swallowed by the ocean. We didn't talk about it much. There was no time to mourn. We had one focus, survival. But there were moments when the silence between explosions stretched too long, when I could feel the weight of the loss pressing down on me. The faces of the men we'd lost haunted me in those quiet moments, their memories drifting in and out like ghosts. I couldn't shake it. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when I thought we were on the edge of breaking, a voice called out from across the deck. It was Lieutenant Commander Thomas again, still barking orders, still keeping us together. Prepare to repel boarders. They're coming in low. Keep your heads down. Repel boarders. That wasn't something I had expected to hear. We were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, fighting off planes that wanted to take us to the bottom of the sea, and now we were being told to prepare for something even worse. I didn't question him. I didn't have the luxury to. We moved fast. We moved as one. There was no time to hesitate. We manned the guns and took our positions along the railings, our rifles at the ready. My heart was pounding in my chest. The cold air, thick with saltwater mist and smoke, bit at my skin. The O'Bannon had taken a beating, but she was still fighting. She was still alive, and as long as she was alive, so were we. And then they came. Japanese sailors, their dark figures barely visible in the smoke, their movements quick and calculated, descending onto the decks of our ship. We opened fire. The crack of rifles, the roar of the guns, it was all part of the madness. There was no fear left, not in the way there had been before. Just pure, unrelenting survival. I can't remember how many of them we stopped. The flashes of gunfire, the shouting, the chaos, it all blurred into one long, continuous moment. The world seemed to shrink around us, leaving nothing but the ship, the men, and the enemy. For hours, we fought off their attacks. And for every sailor we lost, for every inch of the ship that was torn apart, we fought harder. It was a primal instinct. It was what we had to do. When the dust finally settled, the ship was a shell of itself. The fires were out, but the damage was done. We were still afloat, but the question of for how long hung in the air. Our guns were silent now, our rifles cold. But the bodies on the deck weren't. The dead stared up at the sky, their eyes wide open, as if still trying to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't understand it either. I couldn't make sense of any of it. It was then, in the silence that followed the battle, that I felt the true weight of what we had been through. We had survived, yes, but at what cost? The storm had passed, or so we thought. The worst of it was over, but the sea had a way of changing on you. Just when you thought you could catch your breath, it would pull you back into its grip. But for now, there was a strange calm on the O'Bannon. The only sound that remained was the wind rustling through the twisted metal of our ship, the faint groan of the hull as it floated on the waves. The battle had claimed so many of our own, and for a moment, we were left to stare at what was left. What had become of us? I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the bodies of my comrades, my shipmates. I wasn't sure if I was waiting for something to change, or if I was simply trying to hold on to the last shreds of sanity in a place where there was none. The sea around us was quiet, as if it were in mourning for all the lives that had been lost. Lieutenant Commander Thomas came up beside me, his face ashen, his eyes hollow. He didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. There was only the sound of the waves crashing against the side of the ship and the distant hum of the remaining engines. His eyes lingered on the water for a moment. Then he looked at me. "We survived," he said, his voice rough. "We make it through this. We honor the ones we lost." And just like that, the storm was over. But the storm in my mind had just begun. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would go down in history as one of the largest naval battles ever fought. But for those of us who were there, it was something else entirely. It was a test of strength, of survival, of sacrifice. We were sailors in the Pacific, caught in a storm of unimaginable force, fighting to stay afloat. But what we didn't realize at the time, what we couldn't know, was that the true storm was within us. We had been tested in ways we couldn't have imagined, and we were changed. I was changed. Some of us came back. Some of us didn't. But all of us were marked by the storm,